Hello, my name is Leigh Saunders, and for the Strong Women reading today, I would like to read you an excerpt from my novel, Gold Record, Memoirs of a Synth. Prologue, February 22, 2555. Over the past 483 Terran years, I have known my share of men, not a few women, and a score or so of creatures that could not be easily classified as one or the other. I have lived with them, loved them, and watched them die. I am Brianna Ray, and I am a synth. The now long-dead genetic engineers who created us to travel through the stars as perfect specimens of the human species controlled for every variable imaginable, granting us the one thing they could never truly imagine, virtual immortality. I do not fault them for that. They had no idea how lonely immortality can become. Perhaps that is why, out of nearly half a millennia's worth of memories, each stored in flawless detail in my synthesized brain, I remember Gerald best of all. Chapter 1, June 21, 2389. I have never analyzed the thought processes that caused me to spend my 317th birthday on Earth in the relative obscurity of a noisy, dim-lit back street bar in Old Milan, and I don't intend to do so now. For whatever reason, that's where I was, dancing on the table with a couple of newly met, long-lost loves in a skimpy black silk jumpsuit that showed off a lot of leg and left little else to the imagination when I first saw Gerald. Actually, it was the Antarian I saw first. There weren't many aliens in the bar, and her short bluish fur stood out in the crowd. It was Sisal. I knew her by her reputation as a top fence, though I personally never had occasion to utilize her services. She was sitting with two men, both human. One, a roguish-looking sort with a rough-trimmed beard and long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail at the nape of his neck, and the second, a big, brawny thug, who, from my vantage point, I could tell hadn't quite checked all his weapons at the door. Sisal's fur was on end, her claws tapping a staccato rhythm on the small table around which the three of them sat. That she was here, obviously negotiating a deal, I considered nothing short of serendipitous. The deal she was negotiating would be worth a lot of money, and I was between lifestyles at the time. I was curious. I was more than a little drunk and wanted in on the action. I jumped down off the table, much to the dismay of the long-lost, who called after me, begging me not to desert them. I laughed and waved them away, scooping up a couple of bottles off the bar as I made my way over to the table. I dropped the bottles on the table between the thug and Sisal, narrowly missing her paw, and leaned across the table to speak to the rogue, whom I would later come to know as Jared McCall. I feel very left out, I said petulantly. You didn't even save me a chair. You're drunk, he said. I laughed. You always have had a gift for understatement, my dear, I said, flipping my hair back over my shoulder as I stood. It was long and black and rough cut, as was the style on Riga at the time, with its thousands of tiny ends tipped in silver. Of course I'm drunk. That's the point of coming to a bar, or at least half the point. I stepped away from the table, grabbed a chair, and pulled it up beside Gerald, my leg brushing his as I slid into my seat. Look, he began, but I didn't let him finish. I held up the palm-sized TR-90 laser pistol I had filched from the thug. Pickpocketing can be a useful hobby. You know, there was a time when no one thought they could make them this small, I said, turning the weapon over in my hand as if to examine it more thoroughly. Sisal's ears went flat against her head as the thug checked his now empty pocket. I take it she's with you, Gerald, the Antarian hissed. Gerald looked at me, and when our eyes met, there was a moment of challenge. I met his gaze straight on and held it, inviting him to read what he could in my stare. He hesitated only a moment before answering Sisal, apparently satisfied with what he had found, and in that moment I saw that we were as much alike in nature as anyone I had ever met, both decisive yet impulsive, lives balanced precariously on the edge. Yes, Sisal, he said, his blue eyes still locked to my gray ones. She's with me. I thought you worked alone, the thug said. Gerald shrugged, breaking eye contact with me. Depends on the job. We won't pay you any more just because you have a partner, Sisal said, her claws resuming their incessant tapping on the table. And you wouldn't pay him any less, even if he did the job alone, I told her, looking away from Gerald as I spoke and directly at Sisal for the first time. For an Antarian, she was small, but the muscles that rippled beneath her fur showed that she had more than compensated for her lack of stature. Cecile pretended to ignore me, a minute flick of her left ear, her only acknowledgement of my comment. Very well, she said, breaking the strained silence. Let's get on with this. The thug settled back in his chair, obviously disappointed that he wasn't going to get the chance to throw me out of the bar. He scowled as I tucked his TR-90 into my boot. Cecile ignored him and resumed her discussion of the job. Our client would like for this transaction to be concluded as quickly as possible. How you go about it is of no concern to us. She slipped a data card across the table to Gerald. This is all the information we have been able to obtain. There is also an access code to a secured account. The password on this card will authorize you to withdraw 1/3 of your payment immediately to cover your expenses. A delivery point is identified for you as well. Upon delivery, you will be given a new password to authorize the balance of your payment. Gerald inserted the card into a pocket-sized reader and scanned the contents. I leaned in close, partner-like, to read it with him. The object in question, which was still unknown to me, apparently merited some of the more stringent security measures I had ever encountered, and in spite of these, had still exchanged hands several times over the 5-decade span recorded on the data card. But it was only the latest owner whose efforts, both in its acquisition and continued ownership, particularly interested me. Cecile's data include detailed schematics of the security field surrounding the object, blueprints for the museum where it was located, and even a minute-by-minute surveillance report of the activities of everyone who had been in the same room with it for the previous week, a lengthy list at that. I'm curious, I said, looking up from the screen. If you have all this information, why don't you just do the job yourselves? Why are they asked to do it? Our client doesn't want his involvement to be known. It would be very difficult to anyone to connect you to him, Cecile began, her tone condescending. Besides, the thug added, if you got killed in the process, who'd notice? I poured myself another drink. Anything else we should know, I asked, offering drinks to the others as well. Gerald and Cecile declined, but the thug held out his glass for more. The museum directors have a history of changing displays frequently, Cecile said. If they change the exhibit before you are able to obtain the item, the information we have given you will be useless. But I suppose you'll still expect us to deliver, Gerald said. He was speaking to Cecile, but was looking across the room at someone else. I tried to follow his gaze, but couldn't make out who he was watching through the crowd. Of course. Gerald stood abruptly, catching hold of my elbow to lift me out of my chair as well. If there's nothing else then, he said, moving away from the table in the general direction of the door, eyes still following the unidentified person or persons across the room. I think we'll be on our way. Cecile's tufted ears swiveled almost raider-like as she, too, rose from her seat and headed toward the bar. The thug stayed in his chair, nursing his drink. As Gerald dragged me through the door, I stole one last glance over my shoulder and saw Cecile dancing on the table with the long-losts. As the door swung shut, the origami-like folds of the Lengal field enveloped us, and we transported out of Old Milan. The field deposited us on a tiny Lengal pad in a skimmer, a small ship designed for both atmospheric and interstellar travel, whose hyperspace conduit was maintained through a series of intermittent bursts of power, rather like a stone skimming across a lake, and I promptly threw up all over it. If I had known we would be transporting, I wouldn't have had that last drink. I wouldn't have had any drinks, but no one had bothered to warn me, so I just sat there retching as Gerald went forward and popped the data card into the control panel. Try to keep it on the pad, he said a moment later, tossing me a towel he'd pulled from a storage compartment. I tried to glare at him, but another wave of nausea hit me, and Gerald just laughed, pointed out the location of the head, and went forward again. When I finally finished, I staggered to the head, clutching anything that seemed like a possible handhold. A few minutes later, washed up and reasonably presentable, I ventured forward. Gerald was gently piloting us away from Earth, now a medium-sized blue sphere receding in the distance and out into open space. Feeling better, he asked, turning the co-pilot seat around for me to fall into. I nodded, grateful for the seat. He handed me a bottle of lukewarm water and pushed a strand of hair out of my face while I sipped at it, swishing the liquid around in my mouth. Contrary to what you might think, it's not usually a good idea to drink before transporting, he continued. The alcohol buzz and the disorienting effects of the field combine poorly. I gave him a look that he correctly interpreted as being heavy with expletives, and he broke off, stifling a grin. He turned back to the controls and attempted to change the subject. I thought I'd wait until you were a little more settled before I kicked in the skimmer jets, he said. It rides fairly smooth once you get going, but that first push can be a little jarring. Yeah, I know, I murmured. I'd just been squeezed through folded space most unpleasantly. I wasn't quite up for conversation just yet. You've been in the skimmer before? Gerald seemed surprised. Piloted, I said. Gerald raised his eyebrows and made a little humph noise, then swiveled around in his seat. In that case, don't run into anything, he said, and made his way back to the transport pad. A moment later, I heard the whirring sound of the field generator activating. I looked back to see what was going on, just in time to see Gerald returning, a smile on his face. You were very neat, he said. Made the cleanup much easier. Thanks. I briefly entertained the notion of firing at the skimmer jets myself, just for the fun of watching Gerald land on his butt and slide to the back of the ship, but decided against it. Instead, I just shrugged and returned my attention to maneuvering us through the increased traffic as we approached the moon, sliding my fingers across the slick surface of the nav console, expanding the range and increasing the magnification so I could choose the best route. At least Gerald appeared to keep his ship's systems in good order. I'd flown too many smuggler ships where the consoles were so dinged up and unresponsive I'd practically had to pound on them to maneuver through traffic, avoid interstellar debris, or manage with difficulty to dock the ship without wrecking it. Flying this skimmer was a pleasure. Gerald rested his hand lightly on my shoulder, but didn't return to his seat or offer to take the controls. He smelled vaguely of spice and musk, a scent combination I was sure he had chosen to win over Cecile, but which was definitely having an effect on me as well. As a genetically engineered, perfect specimen of the human race, I have not always appreciated the fact that the scientists who created me failed to delete a great many unnecessary physiological responses while tinkering with my genetic code. But there were times, like this, when I was grateful for the oversight. As we cleared moon space, I reached across the panel to set the automatic pilot, hesitated, then turned to face him. Where are we going? Where do you want to go? It was a polite question, considering the fact that he had picked me up in a bar on a planet that was now just a large white spot on the rear display and didn't seem likely to be heading back there anytime soon. I considered a moment before answering. I'm not expected anywhere for a few weeks, I said, truthfully enough. Then, in answer to his questioning look, I added the explanatory lie. I was on vacation. I can vacation just as easily off-planet as on. I see, he replied. I could almost hear his brain trying to categorize me. From his casual attitude, I guessed that he thought I was harmless, a small-time petty thief who was trying to jump into the big leagues and had chosen him for my tutor. That was fine with me. The less he expected from me, the better. He'd almost certainly already decided to dump me on the nearest planet the minute I became a liability. I knew that much because it was just what I would do with an uninvited partner. After a moment's thought, he tried again. You read the data card, he said, then rephrased his original question. Where do you think we should go? Calibri, I replied without hesitation. The secured account listed on the data card could be accessed from a number of worlds, but Calibri was well known for the lack of governmental attention it gave to both its residents and its visitors alike. No identification was required and no questions were asked. Privacy had gained a whole new meaning on Calibri, and I had taken advantage of it myself on more than one occasion. Gerald seemed impressed. Pretty and smart, he commented, reaching across me to key in the coordinates. As he stepped back, he pulled me out of my chair and into his arms. What other surprises do you have for me? I slid my hands up his chest and onto his shoulders, keeping just a little distance between us as I studied his face. He wasn't the best-looking man I'd ever met, but I'd never been a fan of the pretty boy type, and Gerald's rugged good looks suited me just fine. I was aware, too, of the strength of the arms around me and the hint of a temper that smoldered in his steely blue eyes. What could I tell him about myself that wouldn't cause him to toss me out the airlock? That I knew we had left the bar so abruptly because he wanted to avoid an encounter with someone there? Doubtful. That he could throw away the data card now that I had scanned it because the information was all stored in flawless detail in my synthesized brain? Probably not a good idea. That I spoke each of the major languages used on the planet where the object we were going to steal was reputedly located? Equally bad. I opted for the safe way out. If I told you, then you wouldn't be surprised, I teased. He seemed to like my response, chuckling as he pulled me closer to him, kissing my forehead and eyes as his mouth found its way to mine. I slipped my arms around his neck, untying the thong that held his hair and dropping it to the floor. My silk jumpsuit soon followed, landing in a crumpled heap where it was pleasantly joined by Gerald's old clothing. So what is it we're supposed to acquire? I asked Gerald much later, as I lay cradled in his arms in one of the skimmer's narrow bunks. Skimmers weren't built with a great many comforts, but the bunk had proven to be quite adequate. What's it to you? He asked, nibbling at the back of my neck. Well, if I'm going to steal something, it helps to know what I'm stealing. Gerald rose up on one elbow and turned me to face him. Let's get this straight. I work alone. So Saul was ready to slit your throat right there in the bar. Personally, I thought that would have been a terrible waste of a very pretty throat. He bent down to kiss the throat in question. I see, I said. My voice sounded funny with him kissing along my vocal cords, but I didn't let that stop me. Mind if I tag along then? Gerald slid his hand down across my stomach. Not at all. Just don't get in the way. I wouldn't dream of it, I said. I was lying, of course. So there I was, hurtling across space at speeds unheard of in the year I was created, with a man as sexy and reckless and impulsive as any I had ever met in all my wanderings, in search of something that might very well get us both killed, and I still didn't know what we were after. It was the best birthday I'd had in nearly 2 centuries. To find out what they're after and more about their adventures, you can read Gold Record, Memoirs of a Synth by Leigh Saunders. It's available on Amazon and Kobo through Books to Read links at all the major online retailers. Thank you very much, and hope you continue to enjoy MileHiCon.